Hello, and thank you for the introduction. So, my name is, most of you, is Thomas, and I also go by the pen name Mr. Helmut on the interwebs. And you maybe saw me posting tons of GIFs about action games and so on. So, who am I? I like to turn the energy provided by pizza into video games. So, I'm an indie game developer. And in my previous life, I was a researcher, and I have a PhD in interaction design and cognitive science, which is something very useful because I like to understand brain and to trick them. And it's something very useful when you're into game design and trying to do stuff. I founded a company which is called Flying Up Games. It's a very small company. We are 2 to 3 people, depending on the projects. We made games such as NeuroVoider. We are currently working on our next big titles, which is called Altenburger. And I also worked on a game which goes Bury Me My Love, which is a BAFTA-nominated games about the Syrian refugee crisis, a very interesting game. At our company, we do our own projects, and from time to time, we open up to other kind of stuff, and we mostly are specialized into porting games to consoles, and also we help friends from time to time. Our most relevant title and most recently released title is NeuroVoider, which sold about 70,000 copies, which is very, very good at our scale. This talk is going to be about NeuroVoider. I mean, what we did in terms of procedural generations, which tried to do many things, maybe too many things, but it turned out well. We'll figure. So just a little trailer just to get you into the mood. Whoops. So yeah, so most obviously it's a game about explosions, and yeah, we like to do really action game, and we're really focused on gameplay, and where we try to like proc-gen all the thing into the game. So there's literally mostly anything that are generated, except everything that textures. All the sprites are handmade, but everything what we do with them are procedural. So what's procedural generation to me, specifically? It's tricking the player's brain into believing that something has more depth than it actually has. And it also helps to have fancy weapon names. It's kind of tricky. If you're doing something about name generation, watch out to what you put into your dictionary, because we mostly put like an entire dictionary in it. We are very glad that the PEGI never went into this, because there is most obviously many combinations that are not quite PEGI compliant. So yeah, like I said, what's currently procedurally generated into NeuroVoider, everything. And if please don't spoil endgame. Yeah, and and if you are up to a screening tonight, I'm your man. So where to begin with about the current philosophy about the games that we went with NeuroVoider. So the base stuff was to do an hack and slash game. We really like hack and slash game. And what's cool about hack and slash game? Loot is cool, and tons of loot is even cooler. So the more you have loot, the more it is, because it's all about the rewards. It's all about getting overpowered And a game like Diablo is typically this kind of game because the whole purpose of the game is to like smash dozens of enemies with one hit, and that's just feeling super powerful. And so we wanted to do something like this. So it was a lot focused. It was very focused by numbers, having a lot of numbers and very high numbers, because high numbers are cognitively better. So the bigger the numbers and the bigger the zeros, the better. And most obviously, a lot of trash mobs, because you may not have noticed, but in most hack and slash games or games with a lot of enemies, there is many enemies that don't serve any purpose, and they mostly do nothing. These are trash mobs, and it's just to get you the feel that killing tons of enemies just feel good. They serve no purpose. If you remove that from the game will be the same. But they are just there to give some more action and to give you the feeling that you are smashing stuff. Our design philosophy on the NeuroVoider was a bit special because we are a very tiny company. So we are trying to keep things very scoped and controlled. So our idea when we start production on the game was to be very efficient into producing content and to producing a very vast content. So our focus is to produce very quickly new stuff and to keep things simple. So we didn't went into some super fancy procedural engineering stuff. We tried to do the garage way of procedural stuff. So very simple tricks, but there are just enough to trick your brain into thinking that something is actually working well. So the base idea of the whole generation that we had was to manage it with the flow theory. So I believe that most of you know about the flow theory. It's about how you dose the challenge compared to the skill of the player. And there is this perfect zone which is not into the boredom if the challenge is too small compared to the skill, and it's not into anxiety if the challenge is too high. So the idea is to have a learning curve into your game that stay within this zone. When we do game, it's more about creating tension and drama within the zone, because if you do something really smooth, there's like nothing really interesting that happens at some point. And our idea into NeuroVoider was to have spikes and to put that on bosses, because we wanted bosses to be a challenge, a memorable challenge, and also about the loot, because when you kill a boss, you get tons of loot, and it's super cool, and you really want to try that loot right now. So right after that, we lower the difficulty so that you can feel the power of the loot that you just get. And then we go up into that process again. So that was the base idea of what we wanted to do. So it was all about breathing in between boss and feeling powerful. And all our tools are based on this. So we have a mathematical model modeling this, and everything that is generated, the amount of weapons, the amount of zeros between weapons and so on, is all about this kind of curve. So when we manage difficulties, we first start from the player stats. So the base thing is about the HP, the life points, and the damage that weapon does in damage per second, damage point per second. We just want players to feel the grind. I mean, we start with small numbers, and we want by the end of the game, you get very huge numbers, and you just say, wow, I just dropped the weapon with 100,000 damage, and that's cool. And even if it doesn't really mean something compared to the learning curve of the game. But it's impressive to see. People like to see numbers and large numbers. So this is the baseline. It doesn't have any impact on difficulty. We can just see, it's just visual numbers. And we oppose this to the enemies. And for that, we have like a model of the target time that the player should take to kill an enemy, which obviously should be more and more big. and also the time that the enemy takes to kill the player. And here it is, our model of like staircase on our flow theory. And so we use this to enemies are more and more powerful, and they just lower the difficulty right after boss. So you can feel the thrill of being more powerful with your new loot. And yeah, we made a lot of tools to visualize this. So basically we have sliders to test what weapons we can drop on each step on the game, and it was pretty useful. This has a problem in reality. Theoretically, it's pretty cool, but the game is a roguelike game. And if you know roguelike game, it's all about dying and retrying. So you keep trying the same experience. And the flow theory is pretty cool when you have like a main campaign and you finish the game and then, okay, you're done with it. But if you try a game and like a NeuroVoider, I mean, you could finish the game within an hour if you're good. But generally you die after 3, 4, 5, 10 minutes and you keep going, you keep pushing. And this is a problem to roguelike players, because if the experience is too streamlined, it's just boring, because they expect the RNG, the random generation, the RNG factor, and they want the thrill of the RNG factor. They want some stuff to happen, some stuff cool, some stuff bad, and then kind of like frustration to some extent, of course, because you don't want them to be really anxious about your game, but you need to build a little bit more thrill than just having a staircase in between bosses. So the idea is more to have serendipity into your game, so having a curve that isn't quite a regular patterns. And so we started to introduce a curve manipulator into our game. And for that, we had some tools that we could use on each categories of enemies that we had in the game. And we could just have a slider and like create some enemies more powerful and more dangerous and introduce special events. But this was all like fixed into our game. So it's just a slider, we compile the game and it's fixed. What was meaning that one type of enemy was always like the same threat. So it's the same problem again, it's just a pattern, it's always the same enemy. So we thought about what would happen if we just don't have these sliders, and that at each new game we generate the value of sliders randomly. So that means that enemies are randomly threats or randomly not a threat. So we basically created what is an experience generator, because yeah, every game is a new game, and every time you go you can be wrecked on first level and not. So yeah, and it worked quite well, but the issue with this is that we strengthen our game within our niche of roguelike players, which means that we left many people back on the road, because we only focused on the diehard players of roguelikes. And that's a choice that we made by design, because we are a small company and a small team, so we can do that. We can say, okay, no, this one, we're going to go full niche and try to please these people first. So that's what we did. Of course, many people didn't like our game, but mostly the core persons that we wanted to target, they mostly like it, the game. So next, the enemies look. So the idea at first was to have enemy robots that you can combine any kind of parts. I mean, robots has a body, he has legs, he has weapons and heads and so on. The base idea that we had was that any kind of sprite and any kind of number of sprite could combine together. So we could have like giant fortress monsters. It worked on the paper, it worked by design. But once we tried to generate them in game, they didn't make sense visually. There was no consistency into the visuals and the design of the enemies, so we dropped down this, and we back down to something way more simple, way more constrained and focused, to just a few pieces of sprites, and we had something cool. We had something cool with some constraint of colors. We limited the combinations and so on, but we still had like, I don't know, maybe 10,000 different kind of enemies within the game with just maybe 100 sprites, which was pretty cool. And the thing is that it wasn't quite useful because players can distinguish more than 3 variations of an enemy. So when you present something like a repetitive thing to someone, to a brain in action, players usually can't really make the difference between 3 to 4 variations. So the basic idea was to just don't really care about all the kind of combinations that we could make. It was pretty simple because we stay focused on this fact. So we throw only 3 to 4 variations, and we add some offset to the animation just to avoid repetitivity within the own animation. And we sometimes also mirror swap on sprites and call it a day. And it works perfectly. And everybody just like drunk our marketing stuff, because on the Steam page of the game, there's like, yeah, there is shitloads of enemies, but in fact there is something like 3 different enemies per type. So yeah, but it works, and nobody ever complained, and I believe that nobody ever noticed this. So now about generating world. Who of you knows the board game Carcassonne? It's a classic, yeah. So our main idea when designing, so yeah, you see it's a top-down shooter. So we're basically making 2D tile map. And what we wanted is that we didn't wanted everything within a level to be fully procedurally generated, because we wanted to have a control over the environmental design. And we wanted to do also fine-tune level design. We didn't wanted to have dead ends. We didn't wanted to have some weirdness and so on. We really wanted to have a control over it. And the best idea was to have giant maps and fully open. We didn't wanted to have an approach with room-based and corridors like you have in most roguelike games. We wanted to do something really open, like in any hack and slash game. So we went with an approach that is quite similar to what Carcassonne is. We made a tool, a 2D tile map editor, and we were basically designing chunks of maps that has specific connections, and they had to connect to each other. So we were basically generating just a shape of a map, and we were swapping each blocks by something that we handcrafted. It was on the paper kind of cool, but of course there's a catch. The main catch is that for our system to fully work within the connections that we envisioned, we had to do 47 different types of what we call the super tiles. And that's basically unmanageable, because if you want to do something that is really mostly infinite, and you don't want people to notice that there is repeating chunks, so you have to do several super chunks per types. So at least about 10 super tile by types, which means that for a single level, you have to do something about 500 different super chunks for things to work visually and not feeling repetitive for the players. So that's an issue. But something magic happened about this, because we solved this problem just by trying to iterate on our tool and just take advantages of the monsters that we created. my colleague Florian started to ask me, because he's the guy who was making all the levels inside our tool, and he started to ask me question if I could add stuff for him to work more efficiently. So the first thing was it would be cool to have presets. I mean, for each of these 47 tiles, it's always the same connection, it's always the same shape. It would be cool to have predefined type of room with the walls, borders, and that when we create a new one, it just copies these presets and we start working from there. And after that, the second request was, hey, it would be cool to have something to auto-tile the floor, because we want to break the repetitivity, and so we want to have different kind of flow. So I've added a very simple brute force filling stuff for adding details on the floor. And after that, it would be cool to be auto-tiling borders. So at first, we were using black tiles to define what would be the inner shape of a superchunk. And we had just like one magic button that was basically auto-tiling and adding the border sprites and the walls. It helped us to pre-shape a room before we go into the actual design. And then we automated this, made a very simple algorithm to like do the black tile like it's doing right now, doing it itself. So basically we were generating a super chunk, and we didn't want it to at first. And so we end up into thinking, what if we automatically generate everything? And that's what we did. So these are examples of what our tool actually generates. In the end, since we wanted to have a control over the environmental design and level design, our tool transformed into generating stuff, and we graded them. For each thing that the tool generates, we grade from 1 to 5, and the game only keeps the one that we prefer. So it was just something to generate tons of stuff and just keep what the generated stuff was best, and dropping everything that didn't make sense to us. And that's basically what we started to do for all our tools. We used generation to like pre-generate stuff and just manually checking if everything was right. So we also tried to generate bosses. We did. Don't do that. The main issue here is that if you ever try to think about how you would procedurally generate the boss, just the sheer thought of this thing is just, that doesn't make any sense. But we were already down that rabbit hole when we had to release the game, so it's something that happened. We did generated bosses, and the problem is that all the bosses was based on almost all of the same patterns. All bosses are the same almost in the game, and that's an issue, because bosses should be the pinnacle of your gameplay. It should be where all your gameplay mechanics should make sense, and it should be a climax of the player's skill and what he or she learned. So it's very important to make sense of this. And it's also a problem in terms of marketing, because bosses should be memorable and relatable. Because if I have an experience in a game and I experience a boss and it's something that is random, I can't go to a friend and talk to him with my experience from the game, because we will have unrelatable experiences. I can't say, hey, which boss did you get? I get this one. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And so you can't relate, and you can't talk about a game. And if you can talk about the game, it's a problem from a marketing standpoint, because there is no word of mouth. So that's a problem. And of course, we had a problem of balancing those bosses. because of the very nature of what we tried to do there, it didn't work. So that's really something that we didn't done well, and yeah. So yeah, don't proc-gen bosses. So was it worth it in the end? So the game has been positively received, pretty cool. The most of the negative reviews that we had about the game is just about the bosses. And we even had some journalists that came to us and just told, yeah, if you could remove the bosses from the game, it would be perfect. So yeah, that was the main issue within our game. So in conclusion, I love making all sorts of tools, and I continue to make all sorts of crazy tools. And we maybe tried too much to rely on procedural generation. We maybe tried to do too many stuff, but in the end, it turned out well. And now we have changed our perspective from what we do with proc-gen. We still use it, and we use it within our tool to help us in our work. But we don't try to use it into gameplay stuff and to try to make it a feature within our game. Even if NeuroVoider is marketed as a game that has procedural generation within it, it's not quite true, because it's nothing but dictionaries of pre-made stuff and pre-generated stuff that we handpick it. So our new philosophy about this is that good tools and pipeline are more important than actually trying to do proc-gen at all cost. So what are we up to now? We are trying to exercise all our griefs about what we did on NeuroVoider. So our new game, Scourgebringer, is everything that NeuroVoider isn't. So it's entirely focused on gameplay. So we spent shitload of time trying to fine-tune the gameplay of this game. And in the actual game, there is almost no proc-gen in it. And we still use proc-gen within all our tools to assist us for like pre-making tiles, for pre-making shapes, for pre-making a lot of stuff, for also helping us to have ideas. Because proc-gen is very cool to like creating shapes that maybe you wouldn't have thought without just random stuff. But it's just not just about just pure randomness. So it helps us a lot into doing many things, but it's not something that we put directly as a feature within our game anymore. And yeah, of course, it kicks ass. So yeah, if you want to stay in touch, I mostly go by the name, Mr. Helmut, on mostly every kind of social media. And if you have any question, I'd be completely glad to answer them.